The filter you don't see. In the previous post, I argued that logic is only as good as its inputs, and that the information supply chain feeding our reasoning is broken. I stand by all of that. But I left something out. I treated the reasoner as a passive recipient of information, as if the only question is whether the data arriving at our doorstep is clean or contaminated. That is not how it works. The information does not arrive at your doorstep and walk in unfiltered. You are the doorman, and you are not a neutral one. You have preferences. You have favorites. You have a list of guests you will always let in and a list you will turn away on sight. And you wrote both lists long before you started paying attention. Cognitive bias does not just distort reasoning. It distorts the information that reasoning operates on. It sits upstream of everything I wrote about in the last post. Before the logic runs, before the premises are evaluated, before the argument is even constructed, your biases have already decided what counts as evidence and what gets thrown out. You are not a passive receiver of information. Here is what actually happens when you encounter a new piece of information. You do not weigh it objectively. You do not hold it at arm's length and evaluate it on its merits. You run it through a gauntlet of pre-existing beliefs, emotional investments, tribal affiliations, and identity commitments, and most of this happens before conscious thought even begins. Daniel Kahneman spent a career documenting this. In Thinking Fast and Slow, he laid out the dual process model that has become foundational to how we understand human judgment. System 1, fast, automatic, intuitive, and largely invisible, and System 2, slow, deliberate, effortful, and what we like to think of as reasoning. The critical insight is that System 1 runs first. It generates impressions, feelings, and snap judgments before System 2 even wakes up. And in most cases, System 2 does not override System 1. It endorses it, rubber-stamping intuitive conclusions with the appearance of deliberation. Human cognition is not a clean pipeline from observation to conclusion. It is a deeply biased filtration system that lets in what feels right and blocks what feels threatening. Confirmation bias is the most well-known example, but calling it well-known is almost an insult to its power. People treat it like a fun fact from a psychology class. It is not a fun fact. It is the operating system. It is running underneath everything. Every Google search you phrase to confirm what you already suspect. Every article you skim for the paragraph that agrees with you. Every contradicting study you dismiss because the methodology was probably flawed without actually reading the methodology. You are not reasoning from information. You are reasoning from curated information. And the curator is not some external algorithm or media empire. The curator is you, or more precisely, the part of you that decided what to believe before you started thinking. Intelligence makes it worse. This is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The intuitive assumption is that smarter people are better at catching their own biases. They have more processing power. They know what confirmation bias is. They can name logical fallacies. Surely that awareness acts as a safeguard. It doesn't. In many cases, it does the opposite. Kahneman's work opened the door and Dan Kahan walked through it. Kahan, a researcher at Yale, studied what he called identity protective cognition, the tendency of people to process information in ways that protect their membership in cultural groups they identify with. His research on politically polarized topics produced a finding that should unsettle anyone who believes in the power of education. Higher scientific literacy and numeracy made polarization worse, not better. People with stronger analytical skills did not converge on the evidence. They used those skills to find more sophisticated ways to interpret the evidence in line with their group's position. The smarts were real. They were just pointed in the wrong direction. This is the phenomenon psychologists call motivated reasoning, the unconscious tendency to arrive at conclusions you want to arrive at, while genuinely believing you are being objective. System 2, the rational system, is not overriding the bias. It is working for the bias, constructing post hoc justifications that feel like analysis. Smart people don't build weaker rationalizations. They build fortress-grade rationalizations, airtight, footnoted, rhetorically devastating defenses of positions they never arrived at through evidence in the first place. This is why you meet people with advanced degrees who believe demonstrably false things with absolute conviction. It is why PhDs share conspiracy theories. It is why some of the most articulate people you know are also some of the most stubborn when confronted with evidence that contradicts their worldview. Their intelligence is not malfunctioning. Their intelligence has been recruited, conscripted into the service of a bias that got there first. IQ is not a defense against bad judgment. It is in many cases the weapon that bad judgment uses to protect itself. The identity trap. Bias is dangerous, but there is a level beyond ordinary bias where the danger multiplies, when a belief stops being something you hold and becomes something you are. This is the identity trap. It is the point at which a person's beliefs fuse so completely with their sense of self that any challenge to the belief is experienced as a challenge to their existence. The belief is no longer a proposition to be evaluated. It is a load-bearing war. Pull it out, and the entire psychological structure threatens to collapse. You see this everywhere. The person who has built their identity around a political affiliation will not process contradicting evidence as information. They will process it as an attack. The parent who has staked their identity on a parenting philosophy will not hear criticism as feedback. They will hear it as an accusation. The activist who has merged their self-worth with a cause will not treat nuance as clarity. They will treat it as betrayal. At this stage, the bias is no longer filtering information, it is generating information. The person begins to actively seek out, construct, and amplify whatever supports the identity belief, and to actively discredit, reframe, or ignore whatever threatens it. The information supply chain I wrote about in the last post. The algorithms, the media ecosystem, the collapse of journalism, these are external forces. But the identity trap is an internal disinformation engine. It runs 24 hours a day, and it is powered by the most renewable resource in human psychology, the need to be right about who you are. If this sounds like a diagnosis with no treatment, I understand the frustration. But there is a way out. It just requires a deliberate practice, not just awareness. Cognitive behavioral therapy has long worked with a version of this, the practice of separating what you believe from what you are. I believe X is a proposition. I am an X-believer is an identity. The first can be updated with evidence. The second must be defended at all costs. The practice is to catch yourself making that shift, to notice the moment a belief migrates from something you hold to something that holds you, and to deliberately move it back. This is not easy. It feels like loss. But the alternative is a mind that can no longer learn, because learning requires the possibility of being wrong, and identity has made being wrong existentially unacceptable. Psychologist Adam Grant calls this the difference between preacher mode and scientist mode. In preacher mode, you defend a sacred belief. In scientist mode, you treat your beliefs as hypotheses, and you actively look for evidence that would disprove them. The identity trap locks you into preacher mode. The exit is choosing over and over to be a scientist about the things that matter most to you, where the harm begins. A person with unchecked biases makes bad decisions for themselves. That is unfortunate but contained. The harm escalates, and this is the part that matters, when that person's biased reasoning extends outward, when it touches other people's lives. Consider the chain. A person holds a deep bias, say a belief rooted in fear of a particular group. They curate their information accordingly. They consume media that reinforces the threat narrative. They dismiss data that contradicts it. They surround themselves with people who share the belief. Their reasoning, operating on this curated input, produces conclusions that are internally valid. These people are dangerous. They must be controlled. Measures that restrict their rights are justified. Now that person votes, or they run for office, or they write policy, or they sit on a jury, or they teach children, or they run a company that makes hiring decisions, or they simply raise their kids with the same curated information pipeline they've built for themselves, and the cycle begins again. And this does not flow in only one direction. Whose identity is built around being an ally or a protector can cause a different kind of harm, silencing legitimate dissent from within the community they claim to serve, because their identity cannot tolerate complexity. When I am one of the good ones becomes load-bearing, any nuance that complicates the narrative, any voice from within the group that says, this isn't helping, gets reframed as betrayal rather than feedback. The bias does not care whether it is dressed in hostility or compassion. It cares about protecting the identity. The harm is not theoretical. It is not abstract. It is a parent disowning a child, because their identity cannot accommodate who that child is. It is a jury convicting on gut feeling dressed up as deliberation. It is a legislature passing laws that solve a problem that only exists inside a biased information bubble. It is an activist who cannot hear the people they fight for because hearing them would complicate the story that makes the fight feel righteous. It is a society that slowly, methodically, and with full logical rigor builds systems that crush people and feels righteous doing it. The most dangerous person in the room is not the one who cannot reason. It is the one who reasons impeccably from premises they have never examined, and who has made those premises part of who they are, the audit you don't want to do. In the last post, I asked you to check the information you feed your reasoning, to verify sources, to ask where claims originate, to distinguish validity from truth. That was the easy part. The hard part is this: check yourself, not in the casual self-help sense, in the genuinely painful sense, the sense that requires you to sit with the possibility that some of your most deeply held beliefs, the ones that feel the most obviously true, the ones you would defend without hesitation, the ones that are woven into your identity, might be wrong. Not because the information is bad, but because you selected the information to support a conclusion you are always going to reach. Ask yourself, what belief do I hold that I have never seriously tried to disprove? Not the beliefs you debate with others, the ones you protect from debate entirely, the ones that feel too important, too foundational, too obvious to question. Those are the ones most likely to be running on bias rather than evidence. When was the last time I changed my mind about something that mattered, not a trivial preference, something that was part of how I see the world? If the answer is I can't remember, that is not a sign of intellectual consistency. It is a sign of intellectual calcification. Am I holding this belief because of evidence, or because letting go of it would cost me something? A community, an identity, a sense of moral superiority, a narrative about who I am. If the belief is load-bearing, if abandoning it would collapse something you've built your self-concept on, you should be more suspicious of it, not less. When I encounter information that contradicts what I believe, what is my first reaction? If your first reaction is to look for flaws in the source rather than to consider the content, that is not critical thinking. That is the immune system of a biased belief doing its job. Intelligence without humility. The insight that runs through all of this. From Kahneman's System 1 to Kahan's identity-protective cognition to the motivated reasoning literature is simple enough to fit on a reel. Intelligence does not protect you from bad judgment, but the full weight of it is heavier than that. Intelligence without humility is not just ineffective. It is dangerous, to you and to everyone your decisions touch, because intelligence without humility produces the most convincing version of whatever you already wanted to believe. It gives your biases a law degree, a debate trophy, and an audience. The first post argued that you should check what's loaded in the weapon before you fire it. This post is arguing something harder. You should check the hand that loaded it. Because the hand has preferences you didn't choose, instincts you don't monitor, and loyalties you don't examine, and it has been loading the weapon for you your entire life. Audit yourself, not because it feels good, it won't, but because the alternative is becoming the person you're sure you'd never be. The one who reasons perfectly, believes confidently, and causes harm without ever understanding why. The last post asked, is the information true? This post asked the harder question, would you even know if it wasn't? Next, the repair manual, on why the fix is structural, not individual, and the 3 layers the research says. We need